So tell me about a little bit about what you do at Outreach Center. Is that?
Yeah, the Marcella Center for Outreach and Research. We started the center here about 2.5 years ago in response to the many issues surrounding shale gas and shale
Sure.
energy development here in Pennsylvania and around the world for that matter nowadays. And but really the focus was that public education and outreach on very important topics for the state. And so as the number of wells was increasing and the issues and the sort of public outcry was increasing, it was decided that the university should basically start a center that we could be a resource for any interested individual or stakeholder group who has certain questions that hopefully we can provide good science-based answers to.
Gotcha. And so what kind of things have you seen? You're studying a water quality expert. What have you seen in Pennsylvania?
Well, what we're learning more and more, basically every day about water quality here in the state. One of the biggest concerns associated with natural gas development through hydraulic fracturing is potential for some sort of adverse impact to water
Absolutely.
quality, whether it be groundwater quality, an aquifer that's used for drinking water, or to surface water quality, for instance, if there were a spill or some sort of a discharge into a stream or a river. And so, one of the things that I focused on and and other researchers at Penn State focus on is, the potential impacts to water quality. And it's really hard to measure water quality impacts if you don't have good baseline information to start with. That is pre-drilling water quality data. And so so we've done some work here at the university to go out and collect pre-drilling water samples, and then also go back and collect post-drilling or post-fracturing water samples to look at the sort of before and after water quality.
Okay.
And the results of that study showed that there really weren't any significant water quality impacts from over 200 wells that were sampled in the state. But what the study did find is that on the order of 40% of the wells fail some primary drinking water standard.
Huh. That was
Say,
before the fracking or after?
right,
Or
yeah, unrelated to drilling, just a
okay.
pre-existing condition. And commonly you have things like coliform bacteria in water, or you could have, say, high nitrates, especially in an area where there's a lot of agricultural land use.
Okay.
About 25% of the wells have pre-existing detectable concentrations of methane in them. So, there are background concentrations, naturally occurring concentrations of methane in groundwater.
That's. I mean, we've seen, just from looking at videos and hearing things. We've heard a lot of people like lighting their tap water on fire, and
Right.
is and there was, I guess, a study out of Duke that showed that closer to the wells, closer to drilling, more wells were had had methane levels in them.
Yeah, in the sort of the subset of samples that they collected, but I don't know that that's necessarily a ubiquitous
Okay,
thing.
sure.
I think to a certain degree, what that study showed was if you're closer to wells that have known methane migration problems,
Okay,
you're going to see higher levels of methane in the well, and that would make good sense. But there's if you also look at that data, there's also a lot of wells that are in close proximity to gas well drilling that really had no increased or elevated levels of methane too. And I think that kind of got lost in that paper perhaps a little bit. But,
gotcha.
in New York State, the USGS just did a study and showed that 53% of the wells they sampled in New York have some level of methane. Most of them are pretty low levels of methane, nothing to be concerned about from a health risk or explosive standpoint,
Yeah.
but it's there nonetheless.
Do you think that people are right to be concerned about fracking, or is this something that's overblown? Or
Well, it kind of depends on how you define fracking, because that
Okay.
kind of gets used as sort of the umbrella term
Sure.
when it's actually kind of a very, sort of narrow window of gas or oil development. So, the actual practice of injecting water, mostly water, 95% water, some sand, and typically less than 1% of the chemical additives into the shale. Basically the fractures are generally pretty well contained within the shale.
Okay.
So they grow out, maybe a few 100 feet, but they certainly, aren't designed to have fractures grow up all the way into, say, groundwater.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the sort of the physics behind that are pretty impossible, especially with the kind of pressures they're using down there. So there was really a pretty minimal risk from the actual hydraulic fracturing treatment itself.
Okay.
The greater risks are all the other activities sort of surrounding natural gas development. One would be the actual well drilling itself.
Yeah.
And that's where where there have been methane migration issues, it's due to well construction issues. What has happened is they'll encounter some shallower gas above, say, the Marcellus, and if they don't have that gas properly sealed off, then it has the potential to leak up and end up in somebody's private water supply.
Sure.
So in essence, that's what happened in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, probably the one of the more publicized incidents of stray gas. And then you also have the potential for spills of the fracturing chemicals or the return water, the wastewater generated from hydraulic fracturing. And so if there's a spill at the surface, obviously there's some potential for those fluids to seep into the ground and potentially get into a somebody's private well or even a public water supply well for that matter. And so what we've seen the industry do in response to that, minimizing that risk, is installing liners on the well pads. So if there is a spill, it doesn't seep into the ground and they can back it up basically. Create secondary containment. So again, you wouldn't have as great a likelihood of any spills running off the well pad itself. So they've done a pretty good job of putting some improved engineering measures out there to safeguard against those surface releases. But there's certainly always going to be some inherent risks associated.
Sure. How
real activity occurring at the land surface, so things can happen.
How concerning have been the overall impacts of drilling in Pennsylvania on water quality?
Well, I think from a public perception standpoint, that's probably one of the most concerning aspects of all of this. We're starting to see air quality considerations.
Okay.
Sort of bubble up, no pun intended, to the sort of the mainstream media, and people are becoming concerned about the sort of the fugitive emissions, whether it's methane coming out of the well during drilling or fracturing, or even coming out of the pipes and tanks during the production phase. So that's a very active area of research right now. There's a lot of concern about the chemicals that are used in hydraulic fracturing.
Yeah.
So that has received a lot of media attention too.
Are these things that are just a matter of public perception and public perception being wrong, or is there something that people should really be concerned about?
Well, I think anytime you have any sort of chemical that you don't want in your drinking water, out there potentially able to be spilled, there should be some level of concern, and there obviously needs to be regulations and enforcement to make sure that you don't have issues. So I think people should be somewhat concerned, and I think just having sort of eyes open and watchdogs out there is a good thing. I think just how common these spills are and how often people's wells actually become contaminated and how often people actually get sick probably gets a bit overblown in the media. And obviously the media tends to, sort of pump these things up a bit, and that kind of gets people buying newspapers and the news, and so. So I certainly don't want to minimize anything, because some spills have happened, and it's a rare thing, but some people's water supplies have been affected too. So when it does happen, it's a very real situation that has some deep impacts to those affected.
Has it ever gotten into any of the chemicals, or gotten into public water supplies other than? I mean, I know that there's been some wells, but the actual municipal drinking water supplies.
Yeah, well, what has happened is that, especially in western Pennsylvania, there were 15 or 16 combination of industrial treatment plants and publicly owned, municipal wastewater treatment plants that were receiving some of the wastewater, the flowback waters, it's commonly known. And so basically they were, blending this flowback water, not really doing much, if any, treatment, and just kind of relying on dilution as the solution of pollution. And what they were starting to realize is, for one, the high levels of salts can impact the effectiveness of the biological treatment that's in a lot of these municipal treatment plants.
Sure.
So that reduces the overall effectiveness of the treatment system itself. And then in addition, some of the naturally occurring bromides that are in this wastewater, are discharged into the stream or the river, and then 10 miles downstream, there's another town that's got an intake that's withdrawing water out of that same river for drinking water.
Yeah.
And so then when they go to run their surface water through a treatment process for drinking water purposes, what they were running into was that the bromides were reacting with the disinfectants, primarily the chlorine, and you actually start to form disinfection byproducts, which are regulated carcinogen.
Okay.
And so they were starting to have troubles meeting their disinfection byproduct contaminant levels in the drinking water, and actually would have to put out occasional advisories saying, hey, the water's not meeting this certain standard. And so it was realized that, hey, this is just not a good idea. Shouldn't be a disposal outlet. And so that's in essence when our governor and our Secretary of DEP told the industry to stop taking their wastewater to those treatment plants. And in addition, we've since adopted much more stringent treatment standards for any of this water. If it is to be treated for discharge, in essence, it needs to meet drinking water standards. So that was a pretty significant increase in the regulations for the industry.
They're treating it as that it can be actually drunk after the.
If it's basically for not all drinking water standards, but what they're focused on are things like total dissolved solids.
Sure.
Sort of more or less a measure of the salt content of the water, and also chlorides and barium and strontium are the four primary treatment standards that need to be met.
Okay.
And in essence, the total dissolved solids and chloride standards that have been set are the same standards for drinking water here. So it's actually a secondary standard, more so for aesthetics and taste.
Okay.
As set by the EPA. So in essence, what they're saying is you got to get almost all of the salt and anything else out of this water. So from that standpoint, it's almost like it's drinking water quality. And so what we're seeing is that there's not very many treatment plants that have the ability to treat the water to that level, and it's relatively expensive to treat the water to that level.
Sure.
So what they're doing is recycling that flowback water for reuse for hydraulic fracturing rather than trying to treat it for disposal purposes.
So there was a few people that, as you probably heard, New York's thinking about fracking, and it's going to be, I guess, any day now a decision. And there were some people that came up from Pennsylvania, and they were talking about they did this ad, and they're talking about having blisters and all these different health effects. Is that, I know that, is that something you can speak to about at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's an area where perhaps we're lacking in any sort of coordinated research.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of anecdotal information out there, but you don't really see a lot of, medical studies.
Sure,
and,
sure.
Conclusive studies. So you just kind of hear about it here and there occasionally, and I know there's been, some sort of high-profile cases in Pennsylvania in the last couple of years where there were complaints that, there's, for instance, barium in my drinking water well, and it's causing me health-related problems. Yeah. And then they go in and do the testing, and they realize that, yeah, you know what, you do have some barium in your water, but it's not related to the drilling. It's, there's another source of it from, a landfill, for instance, up the hill. And so that's one of the things, we're starting to realize is that there are some real pre-existing non-drilling related water quality issues out there, because the industry's more or less prompted the sampling of, probably on the order of a couple 100,000 private wells in the state that have never been sampled otherwise. So,
so is it possible that maybe the fracking is going to make Pennsylvania's water drilling, at least wells, safer?
Well, we're finding out a lot about our state's water quality, and that there are pre-existing issues that should probably be dealt with in some cases. So there are some initiatives here in Pennsylvania to have more organized research on the potential health effects of natural gas development, and I think they're kind of in the early stages at this point. So I don't think they're not nearly at any point where they can start to make any conclusions. But there have been some other studies in places like Colorado and Texas where there are suggestions that there are some activities related to natural gas development that might be put some populations at an elevated risk of having some health impacts if you're exposed to some of the potential pollutants for prolonged periods and things like that.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a scary thought, maybe to someone that might be living near a well. Or
yeah, I mean, so it's just kind of like if you're living right next door to any industrial activity. And if there are some emissions and you're there and you're breathing them, then you could certainly expect that you might have some longer-term health impact from that. And so that's again why not only for water quality do we need to do testing, but we also need to do it for air quality as well.
Okay. Let's see. Is there any other things I should ask or people should know about you or your work or fracking or anything?
Well, it's certainly an area that's really caused a lot of significant media press on sort of the negative health impacts. But I think on the flip side of that, one might consider some of the potential positive improvements, specifically with respect to air quality, that we are actually starting to be able to measure, and one would be the reduced greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon dioxide. So we're starting to see the use of coal for power generation be replaced with natural gas.
Sure.
As the fuel for generating power. And so I think you can see some measurable improvements in air quality. We're seeing that the CO2 emissions in 2011 and 12 are lower than they've been in 20 years.
Wow.
It's a step in the right direction.
Sure.
And then when you think about not only carbon dioxide, but also things like particulate matter and nitrogen oxides and sulfur, oxides and heavy metals like mercury that are emitted in the air when you use coal and combust coal, then I think natural gas is kind of a clear winner in that contest. But again, we need to be careful about sort of the development side of natural gas. They run a lot of trucks up and down the road, so they're using a lot of diesel, and so that emitting the diesel fumes into the air can have some issues as well. So, and we are actually starting to see companies use more natural gas powered trucks and generators and drilling rigs even to kind of keep their carbon footprint lower. So so I think there's plenty of room for improvement, but I think on some level the industry is making steps in the right direction.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay, Dave, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Okay.